अस्सलाम वालेकुम folks. Welcome to SIA Conversations. जैसे कि आपको पता है, SIA Conversations का मकसद ये है कि हम एक इकोनॉमिक नैरेटिव तैयार करें। हमारे मुल्क में एक चीज जहां से मैं शुरू करता हूं बार बार, इकोनॉमिक्स has failed. In fact, we have produced no economists in this country. We have these teachers who teach economics. That means yesterday's economics or day before yesterday's economics. और वो डेटा थोड़ा कोट करके सोचते हैं हमने बड़ा मार्का मार लिया। कुछ लोग उनमें से सोचते हैं कि मैं आर पढ़ गया हूँ या स्टाटा पढ़ गया हूँ तो बस मुझे सब कुछ आ गया एंड आई कैन टॉक अबाउट आर एंड स्टाटा। उनको कहो आर एंड स्टाटा से कुछ करके दिखाओ, वो नहीं कर सकते, उनको बस वो आते हैं, फॉर्मूले आते हैं। तो इकोनॉमिक्स का बड़ा मसला है हमारे मुल्क में। तो हम ये कोशिश कर रहे हैं यहाँ सिया में, हमारी जो कन्वर्सेशन है वो ये टू गेट होल्ड ऑफ नॉट जस्ट इकोनॉमिस्ट, पीपल ऑल ओवर। जैसे मैंने एंथ्रोपोलॉजिस्ट से बात की, एजुकेशनल से भी, सब लोगों से, ट्राइंग टू अंडरस्टैंड द पाकिस्तान डेवलपमेंट प्रोसेस। ये है क्या? हमने इसको गिफ्ट कर दिया है डोनर्स को। डोनर्स अपनी मर्जी से करते हैं। कभी पॉवर्टी 45 हो जाती है, कभी 50 हो जाती है, कभी 15 हो जाती है, कभी 20 हो जाती है। पॉवर्टी ठहरती कहीं नहीं, भागती रहती है। तो खैर, आज मैंने कहा जी कि हम एक यंग अपकमिंग इकोनॉमिस्ट को, वेरी ब्राइट यंग इकोनॉमिस्ट, अहमद जमाल पीरजादा साहब, ये पढ़ा रहे हैं यूनिवर्सिटी ऑफ ब्रिस्टल, इफ आई एम नॉट मिस्टेकन।
Yes,
यूनिवर्सिटी ऑफ
that's
ब्रिस्टल
right.
में पढ़ा रहे हैं। He's an associate professor there, if I'm not mistaken, and he's very well on his way to becoming a professor. Prolific guy, does very well. माशाल्लाह काफी अच्छा एनालिसिस करते हैं। पर अहमद जमाल पीरजादा साहब ने एक और चीज शुरू की हुई है, एक चीज जिसको मुझे समझ नहीं आती क्या है, बट ये खुद समझाएंगे। उसका नाम है इकोनॉमिक एडवाइजरी ग्रुप। आप लोगों को याद होगा, हमने आदिल नाखुदा से भी बात की थी, IBA से, वो भी इस ग्रुप के हिस्सा है। तो शुरू करिए जी, बताइए ये क्या है इकोनॉमिक एडवाइजरी ग्रुप? ये क्या आपने नाम रखा हुआ है? सरकार ने आपको बनाया हुआ है? किसने बनाया हुआ है? क्या चक्कर है इकोनॉमिक एडवाइजरी ग्रुप, क्या है ये?
Gee, first of all, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure talking to you. So it's rather an honor talking to you. Uh, Economic Advisory Group, to be honest, like it came out of just a discussion. Yeah, let's have a group of people, and then we'll basically keep an eye on what's happening in the economy and just share our views on that. So yeah, I think it's been 3 years, 4 years maybe. तो इस तरह ये मर्ज हुआ। आई गेस आई वाज अप्रोच्ड बाय फ्यू पीपल। आई थिंक इसमें अली
चलिए
सलमान भी
बताइए,
है।
इसमें आप लोगों ने अभी तक, जरा ब्रीफली बताइए, आप लोगों ने अभी तक क्या किया है? क्या मुझे की हेडलाइंस है वो दे, जो कि नहीं कहते सिलिकॉन वैली में कहते हैं एलिवेटर पिच। आप लोगों ने अभी तक क्या किया?
आई थिंक एक तो हमने टेक्सटाइल वालों को बहुत ऑफेंड किया एक टाइम में, विच आई टेक एज एन अचीवमेंट। द
ऑफेंड
अदर
किया?
थिंग,
मैं तो उनको
ऑफेंड किया।
डिफेंड करता हूँ। अच्छा चले, इस पर बात करेंगे आप लोग।
उनको ऑफेंड किया। Essentially, the analysis around the subsidies and everything that they were asking for, let's say 2 years before and so on.
ठीक।
Then some of the other work that we produced, उसमें आपने भी forum दिया जिस पे हमने present किया, जो structural transformation से related था, misallocation से related था. So a lot of that work actually got picked up by IMF and some other people as well. तो उसका एक I guess impact था. Then obviously we had a lot to say about, let's say, institutions. SIFC में खैर मेरा अपना stance aside, but then we obviously issued a statement around that as well, which was quite topical, but then not many people were willing to talk about SIFC because of the level of involvement that's there. So this is one side of things, जो अपने views आप share करो और put out a study just to promote the discourse. So that's one side of the story. The other story which I had in mind was कि अच्छा यार, आप discourse तो promote करोगे, let's say you issue a press release or write an article, that's fine, लेकिन आप और क्या कर सकते हो? तो in parallel what I started was कि let's start a public education program जिसमें from the professional industry, from the universities, or anyone who's interested in, let's say, economics, unko you take them in, and then you basically have a two months program जिसमें you go through some of the key topics, invite the speakers and let them engage with the speakers, and obviously have the networking events. So we've run that for 2 years, so that's gone pretty well. So that's the other thing which I think EAG does. In some sense, a stopgap between, say, enrolling in a university and just being interested in economics. So this is, I guess, how the two big things, this is how I'll frame that. अब आगे देखते हैं, I guess the leadership is with Adil at the moment.
तो
So
आपका कोर्सेज को तो बाद में डिस्कस करेंगे, पहले ये बताइए, डू यू फील यू हैव हैड एनी इम्पैक्ट एट ऑल?
I think to an extent होता है लेकिन फिर disrupt हो जाता है. That's how I would say. So for example, जब ये textile वाली बात चल रही थी at one point, so I think we were having some impact. We were getting into the right circles in terms of getting heard. And then from what we hear is there was conversation, उसमें Pied भी pressure डाल रहा था reforms की तरफ. So there were things which were heard, and then there was some resistance from the government as well in terms of not
Let me
going.
step back. Let me step back.
Mhm.
Let me step back. I'm having an identity crisis, my personal crisis.
Mhm.
I am now beginning to feel that economics is a useless subject and should not be taught, especially if looking at it from the point of view of Pakistan. Because here I don't think our economic policy has ever been affected by economic research or economists. Let me give you a simple example that I gave the other day too. Through the history of Pakistan, only 2 economists have been decorated. 2 more, 4. 2 have died. We won't talk about them. They were both from Pi. They died. But then 2 other economists have been decorated. It's obvious. The other one is, well, quite, वो क्या कहते हैं, significantly, yeah. बड़े मजेदार है कि महबूब उल हक हमने कोई डेकोरेशन दी. Even people like चल शायद जावेद बरकी, I disagree, but चलो लिखता तो बहुत है. And some other people जो मैं जानता हूँ, किसी को डेकोरेशन ही कोई मिली. और आप अगर गौर करें तो इकोनॉमिस्ट हैव नेवर, I mean, 2 इकोनॉमिस्ट शायद फाइनेंस मिनिस्टर लगे. ठीक है, हफीज पाशा, हफीज शेख, सॉरी, हफीज पाशा थोड़ी देर के लिए, हफीज शेख, उसके अलावा तो कोई भी नहीं मेरा ख्याल. कौन सा इकोनॉमिस्ट लगा? एंड बाकी तो बैंकर तो बहुत लगते हैं. Economists don't figure out in any credible position. They're not even considered. For example, on boards, there are no economists. For example, on commissions or committees, there are no economists. Right? जब ये बनाते हैं इकोनॉमिक एडवाइजरी कमेटी वगैरह, तो इकोनॉमिस्ट को या दो का डाल देते हैं, वैसे बाकी वो इंडस्ट्रियलिस्ट होते हैं या कोई और होते हैं. So, do you find that you are teaching an interesting subject and a useful subject? Is economics useful to Pakistan? And if so, can you give me some examples how economics has been useful to Pakistan? And what turning points or policy points has economics been used?
I think इसको 2 तरीके हैं ना सोचने के. एक ये है कि कुछ implement होता है या नहीं होता है, right? So that's one part of the story. The other part of the story is slightly more academic. People may not like it, but that's more to do with, do we even know what we need to do, right? So it will sound as if like I'm trying to flatter you, but who cares? So for example, let's say when I started my undergrad, I wanted to do macro throughout. So a lot of my impression was that fiscal deficits, inflation, monetary policy, like a very standard kind of technocratic way of thinking about the economy. You said you are having an identity crisis, but I would say probably like if I am to say who's that one person who shaped my thinking, and you may still disagree with me in terms of what my thinking is, but nonetheless, from my point of view, one person who actually shaped my thinking in a very, 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 very meaningful manner or significant manner, I would say that's you. Now, you may have an identity crisis in terms of how you are thinking about the problem, but in terms of you influencing the next generation of economists in terms of how to think about it, and again, that thinking may not be perfectly aligned with how you are thinking about things, but I think that's a significant impact. And probably
let's move it away. Let's move it in this direction. Can you name me 3 or 4 theses in the Pakistan economy that have come from us, forget me, come from us economists? For example, I'm thinking, Mahbub ul Haq, for example, I must say, or not, he had some theses. His 22 families, his poverty curtain, his strategy for economic development. I mean, I must say, I feel very sad when I hear that Mahbub ul Haq didn't get decorated. And the civil service refused to let him stay in the country, so I had to go to the UN and to the HDI, which is a remarkable achievement, but still we didn't decorate him, right? But after Mahbub ul Haq, जब मैं देखता हूँ, तो everybody's been running after the donors and talking about tax GDP ratio and just following the donor mantra. If the donor says turn left, we turn right, we turn left. If the donor says work on climate change, everybody's working on climate change. If the donor says work on gender, everybody's working on gender. If the donor says, hey, let's discuss, COP 24 or 25, everybody's working on that. Can you find me 3 or 4 important theses in the Pakistan economics profession that we can hold up एंड से हाँ भाई ये कोई आया है काम और इसको देखो। हमने पॉवर्टी मेजरमेंट को एक साइंस बना लिया है, और पॉवर्टी जैसे मैंने कहा, पॉवर्टी एक वो नहीं होता जैसे कि वो एक वो कौन सी गेम होती है जिसमें वो एक स्प्रिंग से आप खेलते हैं तो वो बॉल
Guacamole something or
इधर उधर भागता है बॉल, आप उसको पकड़ने की
oh,
कोशिश
अच्छा.
मिलता है, तो वो क्या है? तो क्या
Hmm.
पॉवर्टी बिकम दैट काइंड ऑफ अ बॉल दैट वी आर कॉन्स्टेंटली, एंड व्हाई डू वी मेजर पॉवर्टी? व्हाई, व्हाट इज सो इंपॉर्टेंट अबाउट मेजरिंग पॉवर्टी?
I think इसमें एक तो खैर in terms of thesis वो तो मैं आपसे I sent you a message yes I don't know today or yesterday. I think that's the conversation which I want to have from you rather than you having that with me in
श्योर।
terms of कि पाकिस्तान की हिस्ट्री में what क्योंकि हमारे point of view से let's say ये भी it's very important to understand कि what is it that has been tried or discussed or debated in the country, right? So that's something which obviously I'll want to learn from you rather than me saying what those theses are. At the surface, आज की, if I have a like my very superficial take on this is, if I look at, let's say, some of the theses which are floating around, the one which comes to mind is obviously your take on in terms of, let's say, cities or let's say bureaucracy. So that's, I would frame that as one thesis that's out there. If I think about Dr. Ishrat, he's a lot more on, let's say, governance kind of reform, which overlaps a lot with you as well. But then I would say you go a lot further in terms of not just institutions, but also thinking about, say, cities and all those things. But nonetheless, he's got his thesis as well. Say, I would say it's more liberalization plus governance, and that's his solution to the problem. Um, I'm not so sure about what else is there. We do hear about local governments here and there, but I'm not sure whether that appears in a systematic way. It does appear as, okay, fine, it's good, we should do it somehow, whatever, but it's not in a broader framework vis-a-vis why we should do it, right? So I kind of feel that that's some of,
So
there are things floating around, but
you
then
see the
it's a bit
reasons for my existential or a identity crisis, right? Now,
from
let me
this,
take the conversation
yeah.
in that direction. Chale, you EAG people, you represent EAG
Mm,
today, okay? We can talk to all of you together once too. Let's do that too. But let's look at the EAG. Mashallah, you spent 3 years in a group setting talking about problems. So
mm,
I admire
mm,
that because quite frankly, Pakistani में इतना दम नहीं होता कि वो ज्यादा देर लास्ट करे. तो आप लोगों ने 3 साल
mm,
का, and I see your publications regularly. तो
mm,
जरा टेक अ बर्ड्स आई व्यू और मुझे बताएं कि अगर सपोजिंग कल को, and I hope it will happen, someday it will happen, you are called in
mm,
to be, or one of you is called in to be the finance minister, and you are going to call the shots. So,
mm,
first of all, what will be the key problems that you'll identify? One. And two, what are the solutions to those problems that you'll propose? And the
mm.
objective, what will be your objective? Is your objective going to be just pure getting an IMF program, or do you have some other objectives? So पहले मेरा ख्याल शुरू करें, your objective, problems क्या है, फिर objectives क्या है, और फिर तीसरा कि आपकी solutions क्या होंगी?
I think, slowly, I don't know, maybe 2 years before or whatever, like I may, or not 2 years before, let's say at some point I may have had a very clear answer to this, but now I'm kind of increasingly thinking that maybe the solution is not very technocratic. It's not कि आप अंदर जाएं और आप let's say fiscal deficit को fix कर दें, primary surplus achieve कर दें, debt to GDP ratio को आप let's say whatever you kind of sort that out. I don't think that kind of solves the problem that we are facing over here. Like just to quote some numbers, right? And they're pretty useful. I mean, for example, the remittance stuff which I was working on. So Usme, one of the things that comes out, maybe we can discuss it later, is a lot of in what we did was in the districts, we kind of looked at the districts and saw कि कौन से districts हैं जिनमें remittance ज़्यादा आती है, both in terms of the proportion of income and also the number of households or the fraction of households who are getting the remittance. And then we saw, okay, fine, in districts, the structure kaisa hai? Like, are they different in any meaningful way, which matters for, let's say, economic growth and the broader discussion around prosperity? Well, one thing that comes out very clearly is that the districts which do receive remittances or a higher share of remittances, they tend to have more people working in the construction sector. I mean, as a percentage of the labor force of that district. There are more people working in the construction sector and less people working in the industry sector relative to districts जहाँ पे remittances का flow कम है. Now, even my instinct was very similar कि अच्छा maybe the solution lies in कि इन लोगों को किसी तरह हम convince करें कि वो construction या let's say ये non-tradable sectors और जो less dynamic sectors हैं उधर invest करने के बजाय let's somehow figure out a way that they end up investing in manufacturing industry or more dynamic service sectors, whatever, right? So that's the instinct, and that's what you hear. That's also what that's also what my first thought was on the problem. लेकिन that's I mean क्यों वो इन्वेस्ट करें? अगर आप इफ यू पिक अप आपकी जो लिस्टेड कंपनीज हैं एंड दे आर द बेस्ट ऑफ द बेस्ट इन टर्म्स ऑफ प्रोडक्टिविटी मैट्रिक, दे आर नॉट विलिंग टू इन्वेस्ट इन द कंट्री. उनका जो नेट प्रॉफिट होता है अराउंड 50% ऑफ दैट, लाइक इवन 60% ऑफ दैट, दे एंड अप गिविंग दैट अवे इन डिविडेंड्स for consumption purposes to their shareholders or whatever. So the corresponding figure for, let's say, for the US or the emerging markets is 30%. For Europe, it's a bit higher, around 40-45%. So aapka jo best of the best business is not willing to invest in the country, despite having the liquidity and the resource and the financing. So how do you expect a common person to actually think about these productive investments as per our wishes? And which kind of goes back to the point which you keep on making, कि opportunities नहीं है. अब you can't just force people कि अब it's also not a right approach. अब हमारी policy making की क्या आपकी instinct क्या होगी? अच्छा companies invest नहीं कर रही, अब हम क्या करें? इसका solution ये है कि companies को force करते हैं invest करने के लिए. उन पे tax लगा दो, dividend पे tax लगा दो, वो आप वो जो advanced वो जो भी whatever that metric is, ADR पे tax लगा दो, whatever. So you kind of force companies to invest because somehow you think they're not investing and they're not investing. But then again, they find other ways to move around the system. Agar opportunities nahi hai, so you can't really force people or companies to invest if you don't provide the environment in which there are opportunities which are worth investing in. If that's the problem that you're facing, which again is not new and something you keep on hammering, if that's the environment you're facing, I don't know, like sorting out a number here or there fixes the problem. The fundamental question you have to ask is कि यार जिनके पास पैसे हैं वो भी नहीं इन्वेस्ट कर रहे, तो so what's the problem? What is the issue at stake? Clearly it's not financing. I think that's an important takeaway. I think अगर if the best of the best, despite having the money, are not investing, the problem is not financing, right? I'm not saying it's not a problem. SMEs के लिए, बाकियों के लिए financing may be a problem, but if you think at a macro level, take a bird eye view, financing is not the problem. So and this is also critical कि ऐसा नहीं है अगर फाइनेंसिंग प्रॉब्लम हो ना तो देन आप ये करते हैं अच्छा यार फाइनेंसिंग नहीं है हमारे पास तो हम फाइनेंसिंग कैसे अरेंज करें तो चलें आईएमएफ से पैसे ले लें वर्ल्ड बैंक से पैसे ले लें सऊदियों से पैसे ले लें चाइना से सीपैक के पैसे ले आएं वी गो अराउंड गेट द फाइनेंसिंग क्योंकि फाइनेंसिंग कंस्ट्रेंट है कंट्री के अंदर एंड वी समहाउ रिलैक्स दैट कंस्ट्रेंट ताकि इन्वेस्टमेंट पिकअप हो ग्रोथ जो है वो फॉलो वो इट लाइक द होल थिंग ट्रांसलेट्स इनटू ग्रोथ एंड व्हाटएवर नॉट लेकिन अगर if you agree or if you come to the conclusion that financing is not the problem here, then everything changes.
Let me interject. Let me just interject here. Aren't you working with an old model? पहली चीज तो growth model तो अपने decide कर ले. पहले चलिए आप कह रहे सिर्फ what you said is very good. I appreciate that. But your growth model seems to be either Harrodoma or Solo, right? You're thinking of financing, right, and capital accumulation. Okay? But if you come to Romer Lucas or Agion, etc., then it becomes more entrepreneurship, innovation, discovery, etc. So, quite frankly, it seems to me, जो मैं लिखता रहता हूँ, मैंने जो हक हैग मॉडल के ऊपर बहुत सारा लिखा है, advisory group. Howard Advisory Group, Nadeem Ul Haque was this model stuck, which you call the two-gap model. I'm sure you've been teaching two-gap models. Two-gap model है कि जी we are short of financing. And we are short dollars. So we are constantly looking for dollars in financing. And then we do these silly projects, which gets us back into a balance payments problem. So if we go to the endogenous growth model, then what do you think will happen?
I think just to add a bit more to this story in the modeling framework, I think solo model is a very good starting point. I would say as a starting point. Okay, उसमें आप let's say for the audience as well, you say, अच्छा, let's say for example, if the country is relatively poor or developing country or capital scarce, for example, like Pakistan, returns on investment will be higher. और returns on investments higher होंगे, so essentially there should be higher investment. अगर आप इसको open economy framework में ले जाएं, so there should be money coming in, and that should lead to capital accumulation, and that should lead to growth, right? So then now if I take a step further, what that means is, अच्छा, if we are poor, capital scarce, returns are higher, लेकिन पैसे नहीं आ रहे, investment नहीं हो रही. So one way to think about that is that maybe the problem is on the saving side or financing side, right? So for some, there's something which is stopping that investment from happening. So maybe हम पैसे लेके आ जाएं कहीं से, तो we'll the whole process, the solo model will take us all the way through, right? So that's why. So in that way of thinking, financing becomes important. But the question is financing really important, right? So अगर financing जिनके पास है और वो भी invest नहीं कर रहे, so that puts a big question mark on financing being the problem.
No,
Maybe
I would argue
Sorry?
different. I would say that puts a question mark on why people don't want to invest. I look at it slightly differently. I think Pakistan has a lot of money available. There's a huge liquidity overhang here, and people have lots of cash. They take it out of the country. Capital flight is huge. I did the first paper in capital flight, and I remember estimating capital flight a long time ago. Even then, it was huge. Today, it's much higher. As you can see, Dubai has a lot of properties from Pakistan. Lots of capital flight. The suggestion that what the data suggests to me is people just don't trust Pakistan. People just don't like Pakistan. That these people who live here themselves don't want to invest in Pakistan for various reasons. I'm not saying anything at all. The fact is that an investment-friendly environment invites investment. We don't have an investment-friendly environment. Why don't we have an investment-friendly environment? What does economic research say on that?
I think so. That's a very important question, right? अगर पैसे, and that's where I wanted to go, and that's a very important question to answer. कि अगर पैसे होते हुए भी, financing होते हुए भी आप invest नहीं कर रहे, so the problem is not financing. The problem is not resolving that constraint one way or the other. The problem is more fundamental, more and difficult, and that problem is really what you are saying. Why are people not investing in this country? आपके अपना बंदा remittances को भी आप देखें, वो भी बंदा जब पैसे भेजता है, if you look at the households who receive remittances versus those who don't receive remittances, and you control for education and other characteristics, what you find is जो remittance receive करते हैं वो ज़्यादा they own more of residential property versus those who don't. Meaning these people who are getting the money, even they, despite having the money, are not investing in, let's say, commercial activities or businesses. They are saying, okay, fine, let's get some residential property, and that's good for when we retire or when we come back to the country, and
what's wrong with that model?
Life is sorted.
What's wrong with that model?
What's wrong with that model is so there are two things. So one is, why can't you grow, right? अगर आपके पास, if you have cash, savings, financing, whatever, there are two ways. One is you can really just think about your retirement plan and end of the story. That's perfectly fine. Or if there are opportunities, it all depends on the if. It's not the individual's fault, to my mind. If there are opportunities, then a better outcome will be that you invest in those opportunities and become richer and have an even better lifestyle going forward or whenever you retire, right?
So let's say what the data is telling us, what you're telling me is there are no opportunities.
That's, I mean, honestly, so you have been saying this for a long time. The last 2-3 things I've looked at in Pakistan in a meaningful way, they kind of point to the same direction. That there are no opportunities, either irrespective of whether you are a household who has the money in dollar terms and they get the money every year to the household, or whether you are the best of a Pakistani business who's listed on the stock market and is doing pretty well.
So why is that?
In a broader scheme of things, there are no opportunities there. Why are there are no opportunities there? If we really want, अगर हम इसको economics की language को, if we keep the language alive, the question is maybe the returns are not higher, one, or the risk is very high too. So the risk adjusted returns are not high enough, right? So that could be one way to think about this. And why are the returns not higher or the risk adjusted returns are not higher? There, I think the question is more important, and it's no longer to do with, say, fiscal deficits and this and that. It's more to do with, let's say, like, do you even trust the environment in which you're operating? Let's say, again, So SIFC, for example, they're like, people criticize SIFC for all sorts of reasons, but I've got one very specific reason. So what is it that SIFC has done? If you read the regulation or the law or the act that was passed, it essentially bypasses every regulatory regime that exists or regulates the system. You can say that regime is horrible and shouldn't exist, but one thing any regulatory regime or legal regime provides is certainty. Within that regime, I know what is going to happen tomorrow, what the rules of the game are going to be, roughly speaking, right? Even doesn't matter how imprecise or imperfect. What SIFC has done is essentially bypassed all that regulatory regime, brought the power to this body, which has the discretion to call the heads of the regulatory agencies, ask them for explanation, and also issue directions according to whatever they think is fit for the country. Now, what is that doing? वो इतनी uncertainty environment में create कर रहा है. Let's say आज एक अच्छा project available है भी, मुझे क्या पता कि मैंने एक दफा लेट्स से 500 मिलियन 1 बिलियन इन्वेस्ट कर दिया तो डाउन द रोड वो जो मेरा कंपेटिटर है उसको बेहतर इंसेंटिव्स ऑफर हो जाएंगे एंड my competitor or a new player will outcompete me in the market despite me investing, let's say, 1 billion or 500 million, whatever the number is. So you have kind of created so much uncertainty. So ये तो सिर्फ एक example है, it's a recent example, it's not a new problem, it's a problem that goes way back as far as we are concerned in this discussion. But really the point I wanted to get across is कि आपका the systems are so discretionary that it's very hard to see why anyone will want to trust when investing in the country, especially when they're thinking about the longer horizon and not purely about resource extraction, right? पैसे एक तो ये भी हो सकता है ना कि आपने minerals extract किए और बाहर जाके आपने बेच दिए and you get the money into your pocket and that's sorted. So I think that's that. But yeah, I guess maybe we should also be thinking about the social issues, right? So I mean, the economy is not just numbers and legal frameworks. I mean, there are people there, right? So how good the people feel about the country. Maybe that's also something which should be discussed. We don't discuss it too much because we somehow think that's not strictly economics. But if people generally don't feel associated with wherever they are living, that will lead to very different outcomes versus if they feel that they do belong here, right? So I guess that's also, I mean, I wonder what you think about that.
मैं यहाँ देख रहा हूँ, as you were talking, I just pulled out 2 or 3 indices: the regulatory quality index, the law and order index. उन सब में Pakistan is 120, 130, 140, which is really the bottom of the barrel. If you recall, पाइड में जब मैं था, मैंने दो स्टडीज की थी. एक था क्या कहते हैं, फुटप्रिंट ऑफ द गवर्नमेंट, which is about 80% of the economy. तो अगर फुटप्रिंट ऑफ द गवर्नमेंट इतना है तो फिर क्वाइट फ्रैंकली बंदा इन्वेस्ट कहाँ करे, ठीक है. दूसरी चीज जो बहुत जरूरी है वो ये है कि जो स्लज है, जो रेगुलेटरी कॉस्ट, इसको जब हमने एस्टिमेट किया, ओनली आउट ऑफ 40 एक्टिविटीज वी फाउंड फॉर 51% cost to the government, cost to the economy. 51% of GDP was lost in regulatory sludge, which was running around getting permissions and etc. etc. Now, if you completed the whole economy, it will be probably 5 or 600% of GDP that's lost. ठीक. Now the issue really is कि regulation जिस पे हम बात ही नहीं बिल्कुल करते. And now the point that you raise is very important. And I've said this many times on TV कि जी जिस country में budget पे शोर मचता है, that country cannot develop. Now, you've lived in England for so many years. How many times have you noticed that the budget has come out and people are speculating on the budget, etc., right? Budget is supposed to be a stable document. It's just showing how the government spends money, nothing else. And most of the budget is locked in place. Number 2, जो बात है बड़ी मजेदार कि जी आपके बजट में हर साल, बल्कि अभी बजट हुआ है तो अब लोग ऑलरेडी कह रहे हैं कि मिनी बजट आने वाला है. So every time the government changes its policy, it erodes trust. और दूसरी चीज, लोग बेचारे क्या करें. मैंने सपोजिंग एक बिजनेस शुरू किया, सोचे, आप खुद सोचे, बिजनेस प्लान, हम इकोनॉमिस्ट बिजनेस प्लान नहीं ना बनाते. अगर हम बिजनेस प्लान बनाए, लेट्स से मैं बिजनेस प्लान बनाता हूँ एक कॉफी हाउस का, ठीक है, एक बेक या खीर पर मिठाई का घर, चलो ठीक है, मैं बनाता हूँ, तो मुझे कम से कम एक दुकान लेनी है, उसका कॉन्ट्रैक्ट साइन करना है 4-5 साल का, फिर लोग रखने हैं, फिर मशीनें खरीदनी है, फिर रेफ्रिजरेटर्स वगैरह जो भी कुछ खरीदना है वो करना है। तो आई हैव टू हैव अ कैपिटल आउटले ऑफ अ फ्यू करोर्स बिफोर आई स्टार्ट, एंड देन आई हैव टू मेक अ कैलकुलेशन कि यार मेरा कितना प्रॉफिट होगा, और ये मेरा कोई प्रॉफिट 100% तो नहीं होगा। इट प्रॉब्ली भी रेट ऑफ रिटर्न अगर 10-15% आ जाए, 20% आ जाए, बड़ी बात है। तो चलो 20% भी लगा लेते हैं, तो दैट मीन्स 5 ईयर पे बैक पीरियड। अब बीच में अगर टैक्सेस रोज चेंज होने हैं और रेगुलेटरी निज़ाम रोज चेंज होना है, रोज उन्होंने कहना है यार अब ये हेल्थ टैक्स आ गया, फलानी चीज़ आ गई, फलानी चीज़ है, ये इंस्पेक्टर आके चेक करेगा, ये होगा वो होगा, तो माई फीजिबिलिटी इज आउट ऑफ किल्टर। माई फीजिबिलिटी जो मैंने बनाई थी कि 5 साल में पैसे वापस आएंगे, उसके बाद मैं 5-10 साल खाऊंगा, तो रेट ऑफ रिटर्न तो तब आएगा ना। तो अगर आपने मेरा बेड़ा गर्क पहले ही कर दिया साल में, दूसरे साल में, तो मैं तो सत्यानाश हो गया। अगर हर साल आप टैक्स बदल रहे हैं, हर साल आप कुछ ना कुछ रेगुलेशन लॉ बदल रहे हैं, तो मैं तो मारा गया। तो क्वाइट फ्रैंकली सबसे बड़ा प्रॉब्लम तो इनको समझाना कि यार एक इसके साथ रिलेटेड मैं जो बात करता हूँ, बड़ी सिंपल बात, जो मेरी एक रिफ्रेन रही है, बट मेनी इकोनॉमिस्ट डोंट सीम टू अंडरस्टैंड। प्लीज मुझे बताओ, इस पाकिस्तान, व्हाट यू थिंक वी आर एमिंग फॉर? तभी बार बार आपको ऑब्जेक्टिव की तरफ आए। Are we a socialist country? Are we a capitalist country? Are we a communist country? Are we an Islamic welfare country? पहले तो are we clear on what we are?
वो तो खैर, आई मीन, आई डोंट नो, लाइक, आई मीन, वो तो आई गेस एट सम पॉइंट अगर आप इफ यू थिंक अबाउट पॉलिटिक्स में तो डिफरेंट फैक्शंस होंगे एंड दे
नहीं,
कम्पीट फॉर
मैं
डिफरेंट।
पॉलिटिक्स की बात नहीं कर रहा। मैं कह रहा हूँ हमारी विजन क्या है। Are we a truly capitalist country? Do we want to be a capitalist country? Do we want to be a socialist? For example, अभी तक इस मुल्क में डीसी प्राइसेस फिक्स करता है, ठीक है ना? एंड लीडर्स जरा सी प्राइस बढ़ती है, लीडर्स ऐसे उंगली खड़ी करके कहते हैं गो इंस्पेक्ट प्राइसेस, इंस्पेक्ट प्राइसेस, वी विल थ्रो यू आउट। यार आई मीन अभी तक वी आर ट्राइंग टू कंट्रोल प्राइसेस थ्रू द डीसी, व्हिच इज व्हाट द सोवियत डिड एंड फेल्ड 40-50 इयर्स अगो। ठीक है, हम वही कर रहे हैं। नंबर 2, आप मुझे बताएं, अभी तक वी हेट पीपल मेकिंग मनी। अभी तक वी आर थिंकिंग ऑफ दिस ह्यूज टैक्सेस फॉर पीपल मेकिंग मनी। वी हेट पीपल डू एनीथिंग बिग बिकॉज इमीडिएटली कम्स अंडर सस्पिशन कि यार ये तो करप्शन है। ठीक है, तो आई थिंक क्वाइट फ्रैंकली दैट फ्रैंकली वी रियली हैव टू फिगर इट आउट। कि तीसरी तरफ वी वांट टू टॉक अबाउट ये अपना क्या कहते हैं, वी वांट टू टॉक अबाउट सोशल वेलफेयर, वी वांट टू गिव फ्री हेल्थ, फ्री मेडिसिन, फ्री नौकरी, फ्री दिस, फ्री दैट। तो वी आर अ ह्यूजली पेट्रनेज या वेलफेयर इकोनॉमी। आई थिंक क्वाइट फ्रैंकली पहले ये तो हम सेटल कर ले, what do we want to be? Do we want to be a truly capitalist economy? Yes, we can have a social safety net, but is our north pole that we want to be a truly capitalist economy where private enterprise is important?
इसमें लेकिन इसका भी तो प्रोसेस, लाइक यू हैव टू थिंक अबाउट द प्रोसेस, राइट? लाइक लेट्स से एक सर्टेन व्हाटएवर, सो लेट्स से यू हैव गॉट दिस सेट ऑफ ways, set of paths, right? Socialist, capitalist, whatever, mix and match कर लें. So how do you reach a point where you decide अच्छा यार नहीं हमें इस तरह ये मुल्क चलाना है? So you have to have a process जिसमें learning हो, and that learning gets rewarded or penalized over a certain period of time, and then you ultimately settle, or the system kind of organically generates some ideas which prove successful or are tested and proven successful. So I think इसमें ये भी तो क्वेश्चन आ जाता है कि यार हम वो जो प्रोसेस है वो हम होने ही नहीं देते। अब फॉर एग्जांपल अगेन, सो हम फॉर एग्जांपल अब ये पीटीआई की गवर्नमेंट थी, ये इन्होंने वो मोबाइल के ऊपर वो ड्यूटियां लगा दी, टेक्सटाइल वालों को सब्सिडी दी, चलें, दैट्स माय पॉइंट, दैट्स माय क्रिटिसिज्म ऑफ देम, दैट जो इतनी इफेक्टिव नहीं थी। सो यू आर काइंड ऑफ क्रिटिसाइजिंग देम फॉर द पॉलिसीज व्हिच यू थिंक आर नॉट गोइंग टू वर्क. The right way to go is that discourse continues and people see that discourse and people update their beliefs about what works, what doesn't work, and they then penalize, or let's say reward or penalize the people who are making the decisions, right? And then you kind of go from there. अब वो बीच में, the problem is वो बीच में disrupt हो गया, so all that conversation is gone to the dustbin. नए बंदे आए हैं, they start from the same kind of set of policies जो कि आपके bureaucratic system में और colonial system में, whatever you want to call it, वो उसमें ingrained है, जो system आपको recommend करता है, and they start from that, and then you are back to the same kind of discussions, and it's a bit of a waste of time. By the time they figure out the right way forward, they are packed and they are sent back home. So I think we have to think about, okay, what is that system of, what is that process through which we learn? or the society learns, or the people who are making the decisions, let's say politicians, whoever, they learn, right? अगर वो process ही नहीं है, अगर आप उस process को interrupt करेंगे, so then I don't really
No, but to
expect
my
कि
mind, I take a slightly different view. To my mind,
हम्म
first of all, that process to be led by economists. And economists have to clarify the thinking.
हम्म
हमारे economists, a profession जो उनसे इतनी confused है कि
हम्म
अभी तक, for example, majority of the people want to measure poverty and say
हम्म
poverty is the biggest problem. When you ask them after they've measured poverty and after they stand, oh, poverty बढ़ गई.
हम्म
उसके बाद क्या
हम्म
होता है यार, उसके बाद हमारे पास कुछ है ही नहीं. उसके बाद कहते हैं
हम्म
अच्छा पॉवर्टी बढ़ गई, चलो इनको पैसे दो पैसे दो. तो यार
हम्म
दैट्स हार्डली इकोनॉमिक्स, दैट्स बुलशिट. ठीक है, पैसे कहाँ से दो,
हम्म
चलो.
हम्म
दूसरी तरफ खड़े हुए इकोनॉमिस्ट जो कहते हैं, अभी तक कहते हैं यार इंपोर्ट ना खोलो, ठीक है,
हम्म
हमें चाहिए इंपोर्ट सब्स्टिट्यूशन. तीसरी तरफ इकोनॉमिस्ट खड़े हुए हैं, आई कैन नेम पीपल, बड़े बड़े ये लोग हैं जो कहते हैं
हम्म
एक्सचेंज रेट को फिक्स रखो. तीसरी तरफ इकोनॉमिस्ट बैठे बहुत सारे जो कहते हैं इंटरेस्ट रेट को गिराओ.
हम्म
ठीक है, अब एक्सचेंज रेट को फिक्स रखना, इंटरेस्ट रेट को गिराना, दीज आर कॉन्ट्रडिक्टरी
बिल्कुल
solutions. I hope you agree. You can't do
यस
both. You can do one or the other.
हम्म
तो
हम्म
हमारे इकोनॉमिस्ट पॉवर्टी जब मेजर करते हैं, दे डोंट सीम टू थिंक, फिर वो कहते हैं ग्रोथ ना करो, क्योंकि पॉवर्टी इफेक्ट होती है, ट्रिकल डाउन नहीं होता, व्हिच आई डोंट अंडरस्टैंड व्हाट ट्रिकल डाउन इज, बट जैसे ट्रिकल डाउन नहीं होता. आई डोंट नो व्हाट ट्रिकल डाउन इज. साउंड लाइक
हम्म
दीस इकोनॉमिस्ट सिट अंडर अ शावर और समथिंग. बट पॉइंट ये, हमारे इकोनॉमिस्ट में क्लैरिटी नहीं है. व्हाट डू आई डू विद देम? एंड वन थिंग दैट आवर इकोनॉमिस्ट्स आर नॉट क्लियर एट ऑल, do we have any markets in this country? That's what another thing. Let's forget
हम्म
capital. Are we a market economy or not? Do we have
हम्म
markets in this country?
I think markets तो I mean वो you can have very imperfect markets and you can have good markets. वो तो it's a bit like for example it's I mean it's kind of अब आप let's say इन्होंने जो wheat price को liberalize किया है, right? So in principle that's meant to create a market, right? So now the price moves and that should supposedly determine supply and demand, whatever. But then at the same time you have export controls, right? So so is that a market? Is that not a market? So it's a market, but then it's a very distorted market,
Of
right?
course.
So
That's not
maybe
a market.
so
That's not.
so it's so it kind of depends on how you define it. But then
नहीं,
that's
अब
a
देखें
I mean
अब
it's a
देखें
bit
ना,
tricky.
ये शुगर जो करते हैं, शुगर
Hmm.
पहले कहते हैं एक्सपोर्ट खोल दो, फिर कहते हैं बंद कर दो, हम इंपोर्ट करेंगे. यार,
Hmm.
that's not a market. Market means you have to
Hmm.
allow people to take their own risks. ठीक है,
Hmm.
and means that people have to be able to place their orders. Sugar जो है या wheat है, I am a speculator in that. I have to be able to place my orders without worrying कि government interfere करेगी. ठीक है, you have to allow, you know the famous क्या विक्सेल का मॉडल था, किसका था, स्पेकुलेशन पे. Yes, it happens, yes, and we have to try and figure out कि ये हो रहा है. बट हमारे इकोनॉमिक्स को चीजें पता ही नहीं, और वो कहते हो नहीं नहीं यार ये हो गया, अच्छा इस तरह करो, गवर्नमेंट को इंटरवीन करो. गवर्नमेंट इंटरवेंशन हमारा हर पेपर के बाद मैं तो पॉलिसी रिकमेंडेशंस, पॉलिसी रिकमेंडेशन रोता हूँ मैं, कई दफा रोता हूँ कि यार पॉलिसी रिकमेंडेशन क्या होता है. वो नहीं सर, मैंने 4 पॉलिसी रिकमेंडेशन लिखी है. मैंने कहा यार वो क्या पॉलिसी रिकमेंडेशन है? तो हमारे इकोनॉमिस्ट को अभी तक, फॉर एग्जांपल, आई डोंट थिंक आवर इकोनॉमिस्ट नो इवन व्हाट अ मार्केट इज. Are we sure we know what a market is? ठीक है, मार्केट में जो टोटलमो प्रोसेस है, जो वर्रास ने लिखा है, जो हायक ने लिखा है, इंफॉर्मेशन की बात जो उसने कहा है, इट्स अ नेटवर्क ऑफ इंफॉर्मेशन थिंग. प्राइस डिस्कवरी पे जो लिखा है, जो वो क्या कहते हैं,
तो हाइक का काफी फेमस पेपर.
ठीक है ना, सारे ये चीजें हैं. डू आवर इकोनॉमिस्ट इवन नो दैट एंड अंडरस्टैंड व्हाट अ मार्केट इज? एंड फॉर एग्जांपल, मैं आपसे गिनता हूँ, चले आप गिनते हैं. डू वी हैव एन एनर्जी मार्केट?
We don't
We don't, because the government controls it. Do
because the government controls it.
do we have a real estate market?
This you'll know better.
We don't.
उसमें कैसी
Because the
how does it work?
government fixes the bloody DC rate and the FPR rate. Government is not the FPR से permission लो. There's no real trading in the real estate market without thinking of ways to avoid the government. So when you're avoiding the government,
Well, I mean, you can say a lot of that market is really black market, if you want to call it that. Like like आपको गवर्नमेंट के रेट पे प्लॉट नहीं मिलेगा जब आप खरीदने जाएंगे. So वो प्राइस आप मार्केट की प्राइस ही देंगे, but for the taxation purposes and everything else you presume.
मुझे एक बात तो, आप इकोनॉमिक्स पढ़ाते हो. You must be teaching economics every day, right?
Yes. Well,
have you ever come across the term black market in any textbook?
I mean, you do hear the term black market, but then it's mostly to spot intervention.
I mean,
So it's actually it's a very nice thing to have because then you can see intervention.
तो ब्लैक मार्केट जो है पाकिस्तानी टर्म है. I mean, there's a market, and then the government interferes to make it a black market. Without the government, the
Basically,
market
yeah.
works. ठीक है. For example, let me give you an बड़ी अच्छी example. You know the हवाला market जो exchange में होती है, वो
बिल्कुल.
कितने साल से चल रही है? जब मैं बच्चा था तब से चल रही है. Like as you can see, I've grown up. ठीक है. वो 70 साल से चल रही है वो चीज. हवाला मार्केट में जो मैंने एक चीज देखी है, there has never been a default. Even though there's paperwork, there's nothing, but there's never been a default. Everything works on word of mouth, but it happens. ठीक है. इसी तरह
I would actually say it's a very efficient market.
very efficient.
You even get credit
Yeah,
if
very
you build
efficient.
some social capital with the
very
Hawala on it.
very I absolutely agree. इसी तरह जो smugglers market है, very efficient. I mean, you pay the guy, he'll bring you smuggled cars, he'll bring you smuggled vodka, he'll bring you everything. तो it's a very efficient market. मैं जब when I was growing up, बड़ा market थी जिसमें बड़े smuggle को आती थी पेशावर से यहाँ तक, and the Pathan used to take money to deliver the product, and he never defaulted. So these things exist. Now, when the government comes in, defaults and other things start. So one thing that you and I can agree on is कि market की definition government का काम है. मैंने एक लिखा था recently, I don't know you saw it or not, जहाँ मैंने Olympics की analogy देके मैंने बात की थी. मैंने कहा government is like the Olympics committee. Markets are like the Olympic Games. Government Olympics है वो market define करती है by rules बना के. जैसे उन्होंने break dancing का rule बना दिया. Break dancing का rule उन्होंने बता दिया आपको. और वो किससे बनवाया? ये नहीं कि ब्यूरोक्रेट से बनवाया. वो ब्रेक डांसर से बनवाया. ब्रेक डांसर्स कौन थे? जो साले गेटो में डांस करते थे. उनसे रूल्स बनवाए. उन्हीं को कहा तुम अंपायर करो. गेम चल पड़ी. बड़ी अच्छी चल रही है. अब हम यहाँ मार्केट ना बनाना चाहते. ब्यूरोक्रेट आता रूल बनाता, उसको पता ही नहीं होता. और ब्यूरोक्रेट कहता है मैं रेगुलेटर लगूंगा. अब रियल एस्टेट की मार्केट के रूल्स क्या है? कोई नहीं. Is there any information transparency? Nothing. Is there any transaction transparency? Nothing. One of the key things जो है कहता है मार्केट्स में information transparency तो होनी चाहिए. तो ये हमारे पास नहीं है. तो इसको हम कैसे एनालाइज करें? And how do you explain to our economists that this perhaps is the most important institutional change that we require? And
I don't want to say too much on this. I think a lot of आपको बेहतर पता होगा. I want to keep this for our conversation later. Sure. But I mean, my perception is like a lot of the thinking, both in the bureaucracy and maybe to an extent in the economist circle, is very much the same thinking which was there in the 70s and maybe early 80s or 60s, to be honest. So import substitution, a lot of the fascination with import substitution comes from that period. East Asia ने liberalize कर लिया, अपने आप को integrate कर लिया. Not that they didn't do government intervention, but they had a very open, integrated economy, and they had a very intense level of competition, even in China as of today, whether that's internal competition or external competition. But we are still kind of stuck in that thinking कि नहीं, import substitution से ही होना है, because somehow that's what was happening in the 60s and the 70s.
Government intervention.
Likewise, इसी तरह बाकी चीजों में भी, I mean, I would probably trace a lot of what we discuss in policy circles back to the discourse of the 60s and the 70s in the economics literature.
So here you can understand my identity crisis. Why is it that our economists, young people like yourself, you've got now hundreds of young professors in the universities, and they call themselves doctor and they have fancy titles. But they seem to be still teaching the 1970 economics. तो क्या करें? For example, अभी आपने बात की intervention. अब intervention पे तो बड़ा literature है. For example, starting off from Coase to Stiglitz to Holmstrom, etc. There's a lot of literature on government intervention, and also a lot of literature on market क्या कहते हैं, innovation to deal with supposed problems. For example, there's a whole set of financial instruments that have been developed to deal with risk-taking outside the government, but they rest on the regulatory structure of the government. Once the instrument comes up, the government provides it with a scaffolding जिसपे वो चल पड़ता है. ठीक है? But that innovation takes place often in university settings. But लोग फिर लेके आते हैं, for example, finance की काफी जो वो interventions हैं, वो तो आई हैं through academia. और इवन फॉर एग्जांपल ये जो ट्रैफिक की बातें हैं, सारी विक्री टैक्स जो है, ये चीजें ये एकेडेमिया से आई हैं. बट people debate them and take them on. For example, I can't even get a start a debate here on
अच्छा,
traffic.
मैं आपको एक और इंटरेस्टिंग चीज बताऊं आपको, like you then educate me on that.
Hmm.
So I've got a very limited experience of, let's say, engaging with the Economist, let's say, academically speaking, in Pakistan. एक जो चीज जो it's pretty common and comes up every time, जब भी आपको कि अच्छा यार इस चीज पे काम करते हैं या इस चीज को जरा डिस्कस करते हैं, एंड ऑब्वियसली इट टेक्स अ लॉट ऑफ टाइम, राइट? अगर आपने डेटा भी जाके देखना है तो इट विल टेक यू many hours or many days or nights before you have something meaningful which you can talk about. तो डिस्कशन वहां भी फंस जाती है कि यार इसके ऊपर कैसे काम करें, किसी के पास इंसेंटिव नहीं है, इस पे पहले फंडिंग लाएं और फंडिंग किसी डोनर से लानी पड़ेगी और वो फंडिंग आएगी तो फिर उसके बाद काम होगा इसके ऊपर। एंड देन आई एम लाइक यार इतना अगर मैं सोचने लग जाऊं कि पहले फंडिंग आए, पहले मैं डोनर को ढूंढूं, फिर मैं फंडिंग लाऊं, उसके बाद फिर मैं उस पर काम शुरू करूं, द स्टोरी विल बी ओल्ड और गॉन। सो और आई लूज इंटरेस्ट। सो अगर कोई रिसर्च आइडिया है और इफ देयर समथिंग व्हिच इज इंटरेस्टिंग यू थिंक वी शुड लुक एट as an academic, should you really be waiting for a donor to fund your project before you do anything on that, or should you actually go and do it and see what's there? So
Not
I
at
don't know how the landscape is structured in Pakistan, but मेरे ख्याल से I think there is some kind of expectation in people's or the way the higher education is structured कि अगर आप प्रोफेसर हैं या जो भी हैं, आपने कुछ तो पैसे अपने इदारे से लेने हैं, लेकिन आपने अपना खर्चा पानी पूरा करने के लिए मे बी आपको एक्सटर्न कोई और फंडिंग भी चाहिए और उसके लिए आपको डोनर्स को प्रोजेक्ट्स पिच करने हैं। अब if a lot of your faculty, and I don't know whether that's true or not, but then if a lot of your faculty is operating like this, फिर तो कोई I don't think you are going to do anything interesting. It will be very much donor driven. उन फंडिंग आपको वो उसी चीज की देंगे जो उनका एजेंडा होगा, and they'll pretty much shape what you do, and they'll also end up shaping the discourse. So
That's very
but then
unfortunate.
before we say anything to the donors per se, the question is कि लोग क्यों नहीं इंटरेस्टेड ओरिजिनल आइडियाज पे या आइडियाज पे विदाउट डोनर मनी काम करने के लिए?
ये बड़ी इंटरेस्टिंग चीज है। दिस इज अ वेरी फंडामेंटल क्वेश्चन। आई फुली एग्री विद यू, वेरी फंडामेंटल क्वेश्चन। बट इस मुल्क में ये हो गया है कि दो तीन चीजें आई थिंक जो मुझे नजर आती है। एक चीज के द बेस्ट पीपल रियली डोंट गो इनटू एकेडेमिया। द बेस्ट पीपल गो फर्स्ट गेट आउट ऑफ द कंट्री, the second lot that remains they go to the civil service। उसके बाद जो रह जाते हैं वो बैंक शैंक चले जाते हैं। उसके बाद जो रह जाते हैं या कुछ मिक्सचर है कि वो डोनर्स के पास भी चल जाते हैं। डोनर ऑफिस लोकल बहुत बंदे रखे हुए वहाँ, ठीक है। अब बाहर डोनर ऑफिस में चल जाते हैं तो बेस्ट गाइज गो देयर, देन सम स्टे हियर, जो इस तरह घूम जाते हैं। जो बिल्कुल रह जाते हैं वो एकेडेमिया में आते हैं, एंड देन दे हैव टू थ्राइव ऑन गुडीज फ्रॉम द डोनर्स। बट मोर इम्पोर्टेंटली जो चीज आती है कि मैं जो बच्चों को हमेशा कहता था जब मैं पाइड में था, लड़ता था उनसे, एंड टू मच टू माय शैग्रिन, और मार भी बड़ी खाई है, कि यार इस चीज में जब आते हो, रिसर्च में जब आते हो, आई रिमेंबर व्हेन आई गॉट इनटू इट, आई वाज नॉट अ ग्रेट स्टूडेंट बट आई गॉट इनटू इट, आई गॉट लेटर इंटरेस्टेड, ठीक है। मैंने कहा जी इवेंचुअली इट जो पीएचडी करना तो ना करो अनलेस यू आर ड्रिवन, and you have to be driven by inquiry, and you have to be driven by questions, and you have to really want to change the world through your question, not for example, मैं केस इन पॉइंट है जो मैं सबको कहता हूँ, मूवी देखो ब्यूटीफुल माइंड, आई एम श्योर यू सीन इट, जॉन नैश। अब जॉन नैश ने 24 साल की उम्र में अपना काम खत्म कर लिया, तो उसके जो 2-3 पेपर्स थे जिसने इकोनॉमिक्स को चेंज कर दिया, बल्कि दुनिया को चेंज कर दिया, वो 2-3 पेपर्स लिख लिए थे, उसके बाद पागल हो गया था बेचारा, ठीक है। It's a great story, but John Nash wrote those papers because he was bloody interested, not because he... Same thing, अगले दिन किसी से पूछा, वो जो टाइसन फिजिसिस्ट है उससे पूछा एक बंदे ने कि who is the best physicist in the world, तो उसने बड़ी मजेदार बात कही। उसने कहा without any thought I would tell you it's John Newton, Isaac Newton, sorry, Isaac Newton। And he said कि Isaac Newton क्यों? क्योंकि he said he did this gravity की बना दी, फिर
I remember watching some maybe we watched the same thing.
Same thing. और उसने कहा then he turned 26, सब कुछ करके then he turned 26, ठीक है। तो कहता है यार इतना काम, अब मतलब उसने क्यों किया? He was interested। और जितने भी आप बायोग्राफी पढ़ो of great people, they were interested in the question। I mean, Nash took up the question, यार ये bargaining कैसे होगी, and he put a structure on it। अब देखने में तो bargaining बड़ा कि मैं क्या यार, हम सब करते हैं। मैं बच्चा 2 साल का, मेरी माँ करती होती थी, उसके साथ मैं जाता होता था, टू पुट अ मैथमेटिकल स्ट्रक्चर ऑन इट, वो बड़ी बेकार चीज थी, ठीक है। और दूसरी चीज जो बहाना बनाते हैं हमारे लोग डेटा का, वो भी नहीं मैं मानता। अब कितनी चीजें, हायक ने कौन सा डेटा देखा है? हायक के पास कोई डेटा नहीं, केन्स के पास कौन सा डेटा था? आई मीन डेटा भी जरूरी है, मैं मानता हूं, बट अब बहुत ज्यादा डोनर्स ने शुरू कर दिया, डेटा के बगैर कुछ नहीं होता यार। इनसाइट इज ऑल्सो इम्पोर्टेंट। एडम स्मिथ के पास कौन सा डेटा था? ठीक है।
Yeah, I think I agree with you. I think काफी हद तक डेटा अवेलेबल है, बड़ा अच्छा डेटा अवेलेबल है. It's not obviously as good as, let's say, what you'll expect in the ideal setting, but it's still very good to answer very important questions in the context of Pakistan. Structural transformation आपने देखनी है. Even like I found something very interesting जो इसके PSLM के डेटा में there's a question जो आप household से पूछते हो कि आपके how is your condition compared to 12 months before? And what do you, and the same question about not you but the area in which you live. So that's something which is there going all the way back to the first survey I saw sometime in the late 90s. So that's a very interesting data that's there. I'm pretty sure if people think about this, they can use this data for something very interesting. So I mean, I agree with you. Yes, data is not perfect, but I think there is a lot of data in which you can answer a lot of relevant questions and learn from the international literature and take it from.
But data के
लेकिन
अलावा
coming back to the fundamental question. For example, जो यहाँ पे UK में elsewhere, I would argue. Obviously, I'm in academia, but nonetheless, I would argue the brightest of the lot is sitting in academia. And not because they get paid. They'll probably get paid a lot more if they were, let's say, in an investment bank or somewhere else. But they are sitting here because they like to work on ideas, or they have their own ideas which they want to explore, or whatever. So there's some kind of a drive which is more than just financial in nature, which is then leading this whole enterprise. And Abu Mera Bhai, so he works in, he has his one foot in industry and he has the other foot in academia. So he keeps on telling me, nahi, academia wale both, let's say, lazy hote hain and all that. But even he agrees ki haan, they are the brightest of the lot. Irrespective of inka apna world hota hai, how applicable that is to the real world, that's a different debate. But nonetheless, it's the brightest of the lot. That's where you'll find the geniuses. The question to you is, कि ये culture, what is preventing this culture, if that's indeed true, in Pakistan? It's not money, right? Because in यहाँ पे money matters. People negotiate for their pay and bonuses and whatnot, but money is not the primary driver. Otherwise, they won't be in academia.
Money matters, but you see, the point is, we've also had, in our case too, there have been people who have achieved greatness without making money. Take writers, for example. There used to be a time when we valued poetry and we valued people like Manto, etc. for writing stuff. उस जमाने में बड़े बड़े अच्छे लोग निकले और माशाल्लाह, I think we've got sterling people there. फैज अहमद फैज हो गया, मंटो हो गया, और भी बड़े लोग हैं. I mean, they did very well because there was society value. सोसाइटी की वैल्यू से बड़ा कुछ निकलता है. आपको क्या चाहिए? वो जो बिहेवियरल साइंटिस्ट कहते हैं ना, what we need is not just money. We need money up to a certain level, Maslow's hierarchy or whatever. But उसके बाद we also want what we call fame, for example. And we also want respect, for example. And we also want to be known for our discoveries or something like that. ठीक है ना? तो ये motivation है. Behavioral scientists have a series of these things that we can talk about. वो एक बंदा पिंक, उसकी बड़ी अच्छी किताब है इस पे. Lots of stuff on this. But the point is कि वो अगर आपकी सोसाइटी, हमारी सोसाइटी में तो वैल्यू अफसरी की है ना. हमारी सोसाइटी में you don't invite. For example, मैं अक्सर कहता हूँ लोगों को, when I go to a function or something, कहता हूँ, where are the professors? ठीक है, वो मुझे कहते हैं तेरा दिमाग खराब हो गया, प्रोफेसर को कौन बुलाता है? ठीक है. अब ये
तो like it's a घिसी-पिटी, it's a negative, there's a negative connotation to professor in Pakistani discourse.
बल्कि जो बंदा जो कोई नकम्मा काम ना करता, प्रोफेसर की हालत है. तो आई थिंक वो सोसाइटी
नहीं, लेकिन ऐसा क्यों है? असल क्वेश्चन ये है कि ये ऐसा क्यों है? Why do we have this what do you want to call it, culture or whatever?
I think that's $1 million question. I have no clear answer, but एक मेरा जो हाइपोथेसिस है वो ये है कि we have, जो गोरे ने हमारे साथ हाथ किया ना, बड़ा मजेदार. गोरे ने अपने आइडिया डिपेंडेंट बना दिया कि जो काम होएगा हम गोरे से करवाएंगे. मतलब फॉर एग्जांपल यहाँ ये है कि हमने आतिफ मियां को भी बैन कर दिया. ठीक है, फॉर व्हाटएवर रीजंस, मतलब फॉर गलत रीजंस, बट मैं तो मानता हूं कि हम उसलिए करते हैं. हमने अब्दुल सलाम को बैन कर दिया. ठीक है भाई, देखें अहमदिया जो मर्जी है. फॉर एग्जांपल टुमारो देयर इज अ पाकिस्तानी हिंदू wins a Nobel, I'll give him the same respect as anybody else. ठीक है.
नहीं बिल्कुल वो तो I mean the system is designed to exclude the brightest.
तो दे फाइंड ऑल काइंड ऑफ वेज टू एक्सक्लूड पीपल। तो आई थिंक हमारा एक सिस्टम बना हुआ है, और उसके अंदर प्रॉब्लम ये है कि हमें जो प्रॉब्लम सॉल्विंग के लिए चीज चाहिए वो फिर गोरा कंसल्टेंट मिल जाता है, बिकॉज द गोरा कंसल्टेंट कम्स इन at negative cost to us, because FCDO pays for him, we don't pay for him, so he comes at a subsidy to us. So actually मैं तो उसको कहते हैं intellectual dumping on us. So we got that intellectual dumping, and because the Gora consultant comes with the fact कि जो उसको बुला रहा है बंदा, उसको भी साथ लेके जाते हैं बाहर सैर कराने के लिए, उसको भी गिफ्ट्स देते हैं, तो वो और नेगेटिव कॉस्ट हो जाता है, ठीक है, सब पॉजिटिव बेनिफिट। तो फिर they don't have to look to our people के सॉल्व करें चीजें। Then there's also a bias in the literature. For example, if I discover something great on Pakistan, it's not going to be published in the JPE. JPE में कुछ चीजें publish होंगी that affect the US, not here. तो एक bias है जिसमें हम करें। If I do anything on Pakistan, for example, I'm not going to get a chair in Cambridge, ठीक है ना? Chair in Cambridge तो उन क्वेश्चन से होगी, या फिर एक और चीज भी नेगेटिव बाय कॉस्ट आ जाता है कि JPAL जो है, JPAL was made by Arab money but out there. तो जेपैल को नोबेल प्राइज मिल गया, ठीक है ना, बट वो यहां से नोबेल प्राइज नहीं मिल सकता। तो वी हैव बिकम लाइक लैब रैट्स फॉर देम, दे विल एक्सपेरिमेंट ऑन अस बट दे गेट द नोबेल प्राइजेस। सो बहुत बड़ा मसला है। I'm not saying I'm giving you stabs at an answer, it's not an answer by any stretch of imagination, but this is a deep question and we should think about it. But again, returning to this,
लेकिन इसमें एक बड़ी इंटरेस्टिंग फैक्ट अक्सर मैं डिस्कस करता हूँ कि पाकिस्तान, आप डेवलपमेंट पॉवर्टी की बात कर रहे थे, तो इट्स वेरी इंटरेस्टिंग कि देयर इज अ वेरी गुड सिनर्जी between development economist or applied economist here in the developed world and let's say the people working in the development sector in developing countries. क्यों? क्योंकि आपने अगर applied work करना है तो आपको you need to collect data, और generally आपको data developing countries से mostly आपने collect करना है, RCTs run करने हैं, जो भी करना है. So you need people in developing countries who can basically work together with you and write a paper or conduct a study.
right.
So there's a very good professional reason for there being a synergy, and and to be fair, it's a good pathway. Let's say, if you want to transition to, let's say, the West, it's a good pathway कि अगर आप, let's say, किसी high flying author in the West के साथ अगर आप उसके project में आ जाओ, which is what SIRP kind of does very well, और आप उनके लिए काम करो as RA or whatever, so if you end up writing a good paper with them, so you have a very good chance of, let's say, being appointed or being getting hired by a good university in the West. So that kind of, so there's a good drive for the kind of human capital that's being produced within the discipline of economics. So there's a very good reason for that, and there's money driving all of this. जब आप बाकी disciplines में आते हो, चाहे वो theory है या relatively more abstract, even macro, I would say, because macro is not as data intensive, is not as micro data intensive. It's data intensive, but it's वो डेटा आपको वर्ल्ड बैंक वगैरह की वेबसाइट से मिल जाता है. अब slowly it's getting a lot more micro data intensive, but it's still very far. So that synergy is not there. Someone wanting to publish a very good paper here in macro doesn't need to have someone in Pakistan or India or wherever who could help them with that. So what is synergy? That's not there. So I kind of suspect that so this whole dynamics is shaping a lot of the human capital within economics that's being produced in Pakistan. और वो फिर आपका सारा का सारा development discourse आपका.
Is it of use to us in policy making, for example?
I think whether I would say, rather than saying whether it's useful or not, I would say you end up with excess supply of some kind of talent relative to other kind of talent. So growth और इन चीजों पे लोग बात करने को कम होंगे because that capital didn't get built up. Lekin development, poverty, multi-dimensional poverty, health, child care, even anything to do with applied economics or development agenda, you'll have plenty of people to talk about that. Do we need that many people? I don't think we need that many people in that discipline. Not that we don't need the discipline. Lekin it's a problem. I don't know. I don't have the solution.
For example, one of our biggest problems for the last 30 years has been the energy sector. We've lost tons of money in the energy sector. This budget alone, we have budgeted 1 trillion rupees for the energy sector, right? And that's just for subsidies, etc., right? So
Mm-hmm.
I think we've lost, God knows, but my estimate is 7 to 8 trillion rupees in the last 10, 15 years on the energy sector.
Mm.
So our biggest problem with the energy sector, it keeps growing, it keeps getting worse and worse, right? And this is talking about just power. गैस में तो और भी पैसे पड़े और भी सब्सिडी पड़ी तो अब अगर अगर आपका एनर्जी सेक्टर इतना बड़ा बड़ा प्रॉब्लम है वेयर इज द ह्यूमन कैपिटल टर्निंग टू द एनर्जी सेक्टर एंड सेइंग कि यार इसको सॉल्व करो ठीक है दूसरा जो मैं कहता हूँ कि हमारा सबसे बड़ा प्रॉब्लम है कि हमारे पास मार्केट्स ही नहीं है नाउ वेयर इज द ह्यूमन कैपिटल दैट्स लुकिंग एट मार्केट्स ठीक है कि मार्केट्स क्यों नहीं हो तीसरा हमारा सबसे बड़ा प्रॉब्लम मेरे ख्याल में है हमारी इन्वेस्टमेंट बहुत कम है हमारी इन्वेस्टमेंट प्राइवेट इन्वेस्टमेंट रफली 8 or 9% ऑफ जीडीपी टोटल इन्वेस्टमेंट 13% जीडीपी तो अगर इतनी इन्वेस्टमेंट हमारी कम है तो हाउ डू वी गेट इट टू गो अप चौथी बड़े जो हमारा प्रॉब्लम है उसके रिलेटेड कि हमारी रेगुलेटरी कॉस्ट हमारा माइंडसेट चेंज जो है टू गेट आउट ऑफ द ओल्ड सोशलिस्ट माइंडसेट द कॉलोनियल माइंडसेट इनटू द मॉडर्न माइंडसेट इनटू द डिजिटल माइंडसेट एआई माइंडसेट इनटू मूविंग with the times वो कौन करेगा ठीक है so we have to begin these चौथी और even fifth sixth हमारी बड़ी चीज है risk taking what is our attitude towards risk taking we seem to जो सारा वगैरह ने हमें mindset डाल दिया ना कि nobody should take any risks so we want to give the children scholarships we want to give them laptops we want to give them this we want to give them that मैं हैरान हो गया हूँ for example जब मैं PhD में था तो मेरे पास बच्चे आते थे कि जी हमें दे दो वो क्या कहते हैं need based scholarship So I became very, I'm an evil guy. तो मैंने कह दिया यार नीड बेस्ड स्कॉलरशिप क्या होता है कहता जी आई एम वेरी पुअर मैंने कहा अच्छा ठीक है मैं मानता हूँ आई गिव यू स्कॉलरशिप बट देन प्लीज गो टू सेंट टोरस आई गेट योर जॉब एंड यू वर्क देयर कहता नहीं आई वांट स्कॉलरशिप ये क्या बकवास है मैं कहा कम इन बी माय आरए आई गिव यू स्कॉलरशिप They said, no, I want a scholarship without working. So I said, hey, I don't want to encourage that nonsense. Why can't you do work study? तो हमने हर किसी को इस पोजीशन में डाल दिया है don't take any risk, don't do any work, we'll give you a freebie. So I think that is whole life cycle. As you know, you've seen Pakistan. Keep people, you were also in the planning commission with me. लोग कितना काम करते थे वहाँ ठीक है what was the work culture there ठीक है people were sitting complacent कि यार नौकरी तो है पैसे तो मिलेंगे he can't fire me तो क्या करें ठीक है so I think we really need to begin to think of all these things कि ह्यूमन कैपिटल में चाहिए क्या है किस लिए चाहिए हाउ डू वी मेक इट वर्क हाँ ये बात जरूर है इफ यू वांट टू पब्लिश द जेपी जरूर बाहर जाके करो यार मैं मानता हूँ मैं तो अपने आप लोगों को कहता हूँ आई टोल्ड यू टू कि यार इफ यू मेक अ करियर मेक इट आउट देयर यहाँ नहीं बनेगा एंड आई वुड स्टिल एडवाइज यू डोंट थिंक ऑफ कमिंग बैक टू सून बाद में कभी बड़ी पोजीशन मिल गई ना डोंट द मोमेंट यू कम हियर यू डिग्रेड तो बड़ी अजीब सिचुएशन है एंड आई थिंक दिस इज समथिंग दैट वी हैव टू वर्क ऑन फॉर एग्जांपल अनदर थिंग दैट वी हैव अ perfect market for lemons Pakistan is a perfect market for lemons. Once you come here, your signal disappears. वहां से signal है, you are a professor, still you're signaling. The moment I bring you here to PIT, your signal disappears. तो ये भी एक I think इसमें भी किसी को पेपर लिखना चाहिए कि यार it's a perfect market for lemons. How do you break the lemons thing? अब आपकी यहाँ यूनिवर्सिटी जो 1,500 हो गई है 1,000 PhD निकल रहे हैं ना I don't know what your PhD is worth versus a PhD from Raiwind or Jalalpur Jatta or something. So these are all
मेरे तो ख्याल से I think PhD in Pakistan, I think maybe developing countries, PhDs are generally overrated anyways. Yeah. So PhD is a very, I mean, it's a very technical, I mean, you have the technical skill set to undertake a rather complicated research project. But I mean, like, yeah, that maybe we give a bit too much respect for someone being a PhD in Pakistan.
No, but it should make you a problem solver. I mean,
it should make you a problem solver, and there should be.
It should be a problem solver. You should be a problem solver after you writing your thesis. You should have two skills which are very important. One is to frame the question, and two is to answer the question to the best of your abilities. At least, as I learned, I could never completely answer a question, but I could move it a notch further. Okay, वो तो Newton type बंदा होता है जो question solve करता है. As you remember from Kuhn's work, there are some people who are paradigm shifters. ठीक है there are some people like me who are paradigm fillers ठीक है तो paradigm shifters come once a century or something or once in 2 centuries but paradigm shifters perform a role they move the paradigm a little bit ask tough questions and then somebody can solve them after a while and that's the way the literature moves as far as I can see
that's how I see you so आप अपने आप को like you shouldn't have the identity crisis so a lot of the discourse नहीं, अब younger crowd में a lot of the like, so the problem is कि आपकी contribution होती है in general, but it's not कि हर किसी ने like people are generally going to go adopt ideas and move on with it. They are not going to say अच्छा ये फलां जगह से आ रहा था, right? Not like it's not आप paper नहीं लिख रहे, but you are shaping a society in an important way without realizing how you are shaping it. But having said that, I think one thing is आपने वो human capital की बात की. I do want the reader to really obsess about the question that you raised otherwise कि opportunities किधर हैं. I think हम supply side पे बहुत ज़्यादा हमारा focus है कि human capital में invest कर दो, right? अच्छा जी फाइनेंसिंग दे दो, अच्छा जी और क्या चीज़ कम है, सड़कें बना दो जी, बिजली बना दो. लेकिन अगर अपॉर्चुनिटीज नहीं है और रिटर्न्स ही नहीं है रिस्क एडजस्टेड, तो लाइक दैट्स नॉट गोना सॉल्व द प्रॉब्लम. अब मैं ह्यूमन कैपिटल की बात उस पे आई काइंड ऑफ हैव आई डोंट नो हाउ आई फील अबाउट दैट, even though I think it's super important nonetheless socially. अब आप ये लेबर PSLM का डेटा उठा के देखें and you see the wage average income people earn depending on whether they have no education, primary level, secondary, metric, FA and degrees. अब FA तक the average wage is pretty similar. और जो भी थोड़ा बहुत डिफरेंस होगा, if you control for parental background, if you control for experience, that difference, whatever little difference there is, that difference is just going to go away. अब आप ये बताएं कि I mean it's desirable. I'm not undermining education at all. There's more than economics to life, but just purely on financial basis, कोई अपने बच्चे को FA तक क्यों पढ़ाए अगर FA करके भी उसकी पे या इनकम वही रहनी है जो एक नॉन FA वाले की. The only point where you get some premium is degrees. अगर आपने डिग्री की हुई है, so then there is a significant premium that you get. But then obviously that does not adjust at the moment for the amount of time or money that you have to spend to get that degree. Even across profession, that's very interesting. And I looked at that, but I didn't look at that in more detail. Professions, maybe if you look at the average income, it's not very different. कुछ प्रोफेशंस में there is a premium. वो कौन से सेक्टर्स में? वो गवर्नमेंट है, वो इंजीनियरिंग है, and there are few others, and I have a feeling उसमें भी a lot of the premium is driven by the licensing, क्योंकि आपकी एंट्री लिमिटेड है. लेट्स से आपने CSS है और बैरियर है फॉर अ गुड रीजन, परहैप्स आप हर किसी को गवर्नमेंट जॉब नहीं दे सकते, but nonetheless there is some barrier for good or bad reason, and that is maintaining that premium. Engineering, maybe you need some kind of a certificate or a license by some association, likewise in accountancy. So जो occupations में कोई entry barrier है, licensing है, वहाँ पे तो आपको premium मिल रहा है, जो बाकी occupations है वहाँ पे premium नहीं मिल रहा. So I mean if that's a very depressing outlook in terms of कि यार resource, I mean like it's very, आप development की spending बढ़ाओ, health में बढ़ाओ, education में बढ़ाओ, मतलब ठीक है, लेकिन like why? Like, आप पहले उसको like fix the quality, make it worthwhile, and then take it forward rather than क्योंकि it just sounds nice और हमें let's say I don't know 2% of GDP शो करना है या 3% of GDP शो करना है, तो हम 10 और स्कूल कॉलेजेस बना दें और वो स्कूल कॉलेजेस में जाके भी बच्चे ने वही कमाना है जो उसने अदरवाइज कमाना है. I concede it's a very skewed way of thinking purely from a financial.
That's a very important way of thinking. Again, the government is interfering in the market dynamics. अगर गवर्नमेंट बीच पे ना हो और मार्केट डायनेमिक्स चल रहे हो और रिस्क टेकिंग हो और एंटरप्रेन्योरशिप हो रही हो और कैपिटल मार्केट बन रही हो, तो देन क्वाइट फ्रैंकली द प्रोफेशंस विल फाइंड देयर मार्केट वैल्यू and people will go to it. For example, one profession that works the best in Pakistan is medicine, because it's linked to the international market. ठीक है ना, डॉक्टर्स बाहर जाते हैं, वापस आ जाते हैं, and they get a private जगह है, तो मेडिसिन का रेट ऑफ रिटर्न बहुत अच्छा है. You can see kids turn to medicine medical degree. इसी तरह इंजीनियरिंग का थोड़ा बहुत है. Engineering sector is normally dominated by the government, but if the government allows these markets to deepen, that's why I like to think of markets, not of sectors. मैं तो कहता हूँ sectors are. You remember I used to say that in the old days, stop thinking sectors, think markets. We think too much of sectors. But अगर market का सोचें, where is the market for human capital? Human capital की market की आप एक और चीज ले लो. Talk about it. Do we have a market for आरिफ हबीब से भी एक बात कर रहा था इस पे. Do we have a market for professional management? There's no market for professional management in the country. Because the Seth runs the company, his son runs the company, and there's no professional management. So, if professional management नहीं, तो फिर obviously your MBAs etc. where are they going to go? ठीक है ना? इसी तरह अगर आप देखें सिविल सर्विस में है, जुडिशरी में है, तो वहाँ पे सारे ये ग्रेजुएट्स चले जाते हैं। बट वेयर इज द मार्केट फॉर एग्जांपल डिजाइनर्स, कंसल्टेंट्स वगैरह? अब थोड़ी सी बन रही है, बट इट्स स्टिल वेरी वेरी स्मॉल. And I think this is what we have to do, is think about developing those markets. For example, जो cities की मैं बात करता हूँ, people keep saying technical training दो, plumbing, electrician वगैरह, but without high rise in cities, there's no market for plumbers. मैं अपने घर में अगर प्लम्बर को बुलाऊंगा, क्या करूंगा? 500 रुपया दूंगा, भेज दूंगा, साल में 2 दफा बुलाऊंगा, वो बेचारा गरीब का गरीब ही रहेगा. But if there's a big building, then the plumber will be full-time employed and he will probably become a middle class person. And electrician too. If we allow cities to develop, cities में, that's why I'm after cities, and cities is a very important point. Pakistani economic cities की बात नहीं करते. In fact, I remember most of the big economists still joke at me कि तू cities की बात कर रहा है. मैंने कहा, if you look at history, everything happens in cities. And if you don't have cities, you don't have markets. If you don't have markets and you don't have skills bhi city mein aate, everything happens in cities. It's a conglomerate of things happen. But if you don't allow that to happen, if it's heavily regulated, and if the markets are not allowed to happen, for example, har city mein agar dekhein, jewelers tend to conglomerate jewelers, plumbers tend to I mean, there's a huge wo jo uski kya hoteling nahi, uska kya tha? Hoteling ka lemma tha ya kiska tha wo? एक और बंदा भी था.
नहीं, होटलिंग तो डिफरेंट है.
नहीं, वो जो था, क्या नाम था उसका यार? ही गॉट द टू स्ट्रेटजी ऑफ कॉन्फ्लिक्ट, या क्या नाम था बंदे का? मैं भूल गया हूँ. यू रिमेंबर स्ट्रेटजी ऑफ कॉन्फ्लिक्ट, या उसकी जो भी, एनीवे वो बंदा
नहीं, आई डोंट नो. अच्छा,
एनीवे उसका ये था कि जी सिंपल सी बात है कि ऑल बिजनेसेस टेंड टू क्लस्टर टुगेदर for information reasons, competitive reasons. So that happens in a city, but we don't allow that. So human capital kaise hoga? Chalo, I think we had a great discussion. Let's do it again soon. I think there are lots of things to discuss. Okay? And tell me whoever else is in England, happy to discuss things with people. But this is a problem. I find this probably the best way to educate people. People can listen to it. Whatever the thumb kami hai, so maybe more people will listen and learn. And let's keep the conversation going. Thank you.
No, I'm sure, and I do want to insist again. I think you have a lot
Inshallah,
of contribution.
We'll do it.
So
definitely do it. Okay. I have a number of conversations that I think very important. Okay. Thank you, Ahmed. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much.
Bye bye.
Take care.